looks like shit. It looks like genuine shit. I stole this land. 3 years ago, I moved into this apartment. Looking down at this strip of abandoned land. So I took it. And I spent the past years digging, cultivating, and turning this little bit of barren, weedy ground into my own personal garden. I grow artichokes, potatoes, Brussels sprouts, tomatoes, beans, peas, wild arugula, sunflowers, wildflowers, chicory, buckwheat, and wheat. I got beans, greens, potatoes, tomatoes. Okay, so I'm exaggerating a little bit. I don't really own this land, but that's because nobody really owns this land. And the reason why is, I think, interesting and worthy of telling, especially now that I'm leaving this place. What I'm doing is called guerrilla gardening. And in most places around the world, it's discouraged by the state as something like squatting, right? All land is owned. Either it's owned by the state or by private individuals. You're not allowed to just occupy land like this. But unlike in America, where guerrilla gardening consists of surreptitiously planting wildflowers and perennial native shrubs, here I'm able to more or less intensively cultivate the land as I like. I built a planter box, dug an irrigation ditch, and built gravel pathways where people walk their dogs every day. And the reason I'm able to get away with this is because I live in Tbilisi, in the Republic of Georgia. Georgia is a post-Soviet, generally agricultural country in the Caucasus, wedged between Turkey and Russia. It's famous as a birthplace of winemaking and for its feasting, music and dance, and hot women. But its history is also quite dark, with a deep history of imperialism and foreign oppression. Georgians have always found themselves geopolitically trapped at the edge of much bigger empires. And in the late 18th century, its rulers essentially agreed to vassalization by the Russian Empire in exchange for protection against the Persians. Under the Russians and later the Soviets, Georgia was made into a sort of subtropical vacation destination, with much better hospitality and hot spring baths than Russians were used to. Anyway, things got particularly bad here during the decline of the Soviet Union. State control over all aspects of life had been tight for many decades, but with that control collapsing into anarchy in the 1990s and emerging nationalisms beginning to compete with each other in the Caucasus, Georgia went through almost 15 years of chaos. There was a civil war, periods without food and without electricity, and 2 wars with breakaway ethnic regions sponsored by the emergent Russian state. And the Georgian political system, which came out of this long period of anarchy, was ideologically libertarian and materially shaped by the American political right, oddly enough. American neoconservatives saw allies in the laissez-faire politics of post-Soviet Georgians, not least because supporting little Georgia was a stick in the eye to the Russian government, which still sees all these lands as their exclusive sphere of influence. They even named a highway after George Bush, who visited in 2004. This libertarianism is probably a reaction to the statist authoritarianism of the Soviet Union, but it also probably reveals something about Georgian mentalities going back much further into its history as the plaything of empires. Anyway, the practical result of all this is that from the period of anarchy onward, the Georgian state has found itself both unwilling and unable to exert meaningful control over the private behavior of its citizens. So many things that are restricted elsewhere in the world, like squatting in abandoned buildings, camping and building campfires anywhere, and dumping waste, trash, are more or less tolerated. This is slowly changing, and the state is now much more corporatist than libertarian, but there's still more leeway here to do basically whatever you want. And another basic fact here is that those 2 wars I mentioned produced something like 300,000 internal refugees. These are Georgians who were ethnically cleansed and made homeless, and who subsequently occupied abandoned buildings and former Soviet state properties. For reference, that's about 1/10 of the entire population. It's a huge social phenomenon. So the reason this land was abandoned, and the reason I'm able to garden here unbothered, is because actually this land doesn't belong to anyone at all. So the story goes that back during the Soviet Union, this bit of land and this tower behind me were owned by the Department of Engineering and the Department of Mining at the local university. Locals have told me that this tower was actually built as a full-size concrete model to test the earthquake resistance of Soviet collective apartment buildings. These massive concrete buttresses apparently held a giant machine that would shake the tower in tests. This sounds to me like a typically Soviet bureaucratic project working to the letter of the law rather than the intent. I'm sure you could drop a bomb on this tower and it'd be unscathed when the smoke clears. Probably back in the 90s, some corrupt university administrator had the machine dismantled and sold for scrap. And then after the 98 war in Abkhazia, refugees from that region moved in, occupied the tower, and then I somehow installed their own plumbing and electricity. And actually, you can see behind me, their telecom wires hang down sometimes and block the access to my garden. Fortunately, someone has wired them up, so now you can cross without fear. When I moved in and started gardening, the locals were a bit surprised, but quite supportive. It was completely barren, overgrown with weeds, and full of trash, including used syringes. I've personally picked up and thrown out about 60 bags worth of trash and plastic, including some buried deep down in the soil. The biggest challenge has been the dryness and lack of water. This climate zone is semi-arid dryland, and I don't have access to a water source, meaning I need to organize my planting schedule around the weather. There's only enough rain for growing seasons in the spring and autumn, and everything dies off during July and December. Most flowers and annual crops really struggle without a good water supply, but I've found that perennial plants and deep-rooted native crops do quite well. Corn failed completely, while wheat has been a real winner. This past year I planted it and then harvested enough wheat to grind into pancakes. The dryness has also been a real challenge for producing compost, so I'm able to gather enough plant cuttings in a season to build a small pile. But fungus needs a minimum moisture level to decompose that material. If I were to continue doing this long term, I'd probably get a plastic barrel and find a way to fill it with water for a compost tea, but that's a topic for another video. As I'm leaving this place now, I'm fairly confident that it'll overgrow with weeds in a year or two. But my work here did inspire a couple people to begin cultivating small plots, so I'm hopeful that it will continue on long after me. A guy from Belarus planted an avocado tree and a bunch of succulent stonecrop, which immediately attracted a turtle to come nibble. And the local kids also sometimes wander through here to look at the flowers, and dog walkers come regularly in the morning. But the real reason I spent so much time and care on this frankly harsh, unforgiving space is that I've just really enjoyed being out in nature, cultivating the land and feeling a sense of care for this community. All of the local kids and street dogs know me, and they come say hi when I'm out. And gardening here through all of the seasons, learning the cycle of growth and the rhythm of the weather, has been rewarding beyond my ability to explain in words. I've been able to experiment with regenerative fertility practices and to try to grow all sorts of different plants. This garden is mine, but despite the clickbait title, the truth is that I never wanted to take it for myself. I don't want to live in a libertarian world where everyone takes and takes. I'd much rather build an anarchic one where I can give my labor to make a nice place for people, plants, animals, and bugs to live in my neighborhood. I've discovered hummingbirds, snakes, hedgehogs, and all sorts of bugs. I've also noticed and identified dozens of wildflowers and herbs, many edible and some toxic. Now I'm saying goodbye, and that's okay. Part and parcel of accepting anarchic non-ownership is accepting, in a sort of Buddhist-like way, that I'd eventually leave it. Maybe other people will take it over, maybe not. But either way, it's been a wonderful adventure. This is a slightly different kind of video than I'm used to producing. If you watched it all the way through, thanks. But I just made it for myself, I think, so that in 20 years I can look back and say, this is what I made for myself. Anyway, like and subscribe. Thanks. Bye.